Thank you guys all for being here. I'm excited to be here. I'm always excited to share my story. And, we talk about layers. And I was talking to my kid last year, and I talk about all the stuff that I've done in my life, from architecture school to fighting forest fires, playing sports, to boxing, to traveling, to everything in between, And I did one thing that people may not know about me now. It's almost like a lifetime ago. I used to be in the casino industry. I was a casino manager, a consultant. I did internal controls, table game surveillance, and I could count a six-deck shoe at one point because you had to track card counters and stuff. And that was 100 years ago. I finished school, and I was kind of in the middle of art school at UNM. I got a job at Sandia Casino selling bingo packets. And then they're like, "Hey, you have a nice voice. You think you'd like to call bingo?" And I'm like, "Yeah, if it pays more money, I'll do it." And so I just kind of kept going up through the ranks, and people, my friends were like, "How do you know how to do this? How do you know how to manage?" But my parents, my dad has always been like the chief of the tribe or the superintendent, so all those dinner conversations of being the leadership or the boss, or, I guess I picked it up. And so, I was really young. I was like 24, 25, and I was a floor manager and a casino manager, and then I was 27. I was a general manager at 26 in Oklahoma of a casino, and I was always good with numbers like that. But then it was like tribal politics and all that stuff, and my dad was like, "You need to get your ass out of that, get back to school, and finish your degree and get on with it," And I did, and so I had finished a contract, and I went back to school, and that's where I met my lovely wife back in Oklahoma. So I was probably 27, 28 when I decided to go back and finish up, and then we graduated and we moved out here, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna give it a run. And I thought, I have other skills that I can fall back on, but I'm gonna paint, give it a run, and see what the hell happens. And then 25, 26 years later, here we are. So yeah, so that's kind of my layer, my story, or something that people might not know about me. My name is Nocona Burgess. I'm Comanche tribe from Oklahoma. I've been living out here pretty much since 1989. And then I went back to Oklahoma for about 2 years to finish up school, find my beautiful wife, trick her into coming to Santa Fe. But I've been here ever since. I'm a local yokel. I love it here. I love everything about it. I love the weather. I love the people. I love the diversity. I love green chili, and so, yeah, this is just kind of a little reprieve before we start our revolution against our own country here soon. Yeah. So, yeah, so this is me in action, and all right. So, yeah, and so this is a gallery that I show at in Scottsdale. I'll be there next Thursday, so if you're in the Valley next Thursday, come by. It's Marshall Gallery. I have a show there every March, and so right now I've just been painting my ready for. And so, I always use this. I don't know how many painters have had a little sip of paint water, but put a little bourbon in it, and it works. So, all right. So this is kind of the layers. This is kind of how I do it. I had gotten this commission from the gallery. I had this painting, and it was huge. Well, it's huge. It's still at the galleries at Santa Fe. And these people loved it, but it was too big. But they wanted kind of a very similar painting. And so the guy in the painting, I believe, is standing up. And so in order to do that, so I had to readjust the painting. So I had my son model. This is our son. And so I had him model, because I told him if the painting is going to be shorter and narrower, that the position had to change. And so I used him as the model, and he's always like, "What am I doing?" And he's 15, so. And so I used that, and then I just kind of drew what I needed over the top of him over a Xerox. And so this is the layers. This is the process. And so I sketch it out with paint, and I use paint pens, and then you just kind of filling it all in. And so this is kind of the process. And I paint on a black canvas, which is very unusual. And this process started in college. I was going to UNM. I was in advanced painting with an instructor named Nick Abdullah, and who I absolutely love. And he's one of my main men that kind of got me rolling. Other than my dad, Nick's probably been a big influence. And so anyway, you're 20 something, and then he says, "Next week I want everyone to bring in a black canvas with black gesso." Most of us never heard. It's like, what are we doing? crying around. So anyway, he said, nothing smaller than 18 by 24. So anyway, we took it, and then there was a model. She was laying on a table, and he had like this green light on her. And so some of us were already in printmaking, and so we were printing on black paper. So we kind of had an idea of what we were going to do, and other people didn't. And so he said, well, what you're going to do is you're going to start in the middle ground. So and then you're going to come outward. So the last stuff you're putting on is the brightest stuff, whereas like when you paint on white, you're painting in. You're going darker, darker, darker. So I always say it's kind of like painting on white is kind of like carving into a stone. You're going in. Whereas like painting on black is like building on clay. You're kind of coming outward. You're building out, and then you in sometimes, but then you come back out. So anyway, that's kind of what I kind of used the sample. And so I always kind of call it painting outwardly because I'm kind of coming this way, and then I'm painting around the shadows and around the dark. And so that's kind of the process. And so I was really slim at the time, and so he used to call me Flacco. And so everybody did this. Everybody hated it. I really liked it. It kind of worked in my brain. And after we had critiques and everybody was upset, and he comes over to me and he goes, Flacco, he goes, for the rest of the semester, I want you to paint this way, no matter what the assignment is. He said, I give this class every semester to every advanced painting class. He said, one person out of every 10 classes probably gets it. He said, but I just want to see, for people to think differently. And we did, and then that was probably 1993, so I've kind of made a career out of that. And it just really, I just see it that way. And that's, that was the purpose for him to kind of pluck out that one that maybe, and made it look different. And it really gives it a sense of like heaviness. And you really have to work because that dark color just kind of eats it up. So you really have to layer a lot of these colors and glazes. And so this is the final. And so, so I used the face of the original person on there, and then my son was like, hey, can you do one and use my face? And so that's in the works. So that's kind of the process. You kind of see, and then I have other ones here. So this is the same thing. This is kind of the sketch. And then after I kind of sketch it out in like gray or paint or whatever's available, and then I kind of put washes over the top of it and kind of builds from there. And so the funny story, this guy's named Choctaw Bill, and the photograph is from 1920s. It says 1920s, and it was taken in Mora, New Mexico. And Choctaw Bill was kind of this preacher. He had like 14 kids and 2 wives, and I don't know, like that's about all it said. And he was from Texas, and I think his mother was Choctaw. And so anyway, with the gun, I'm researching this gun. You can see the picture there. I'm researching this gun because I know, when it's in a gallery, someone's going to ask, what's that gun? And so I'm researching this thing, and I probably spent 45 minutes because I knew it was a Colt revolver. So I'm looking at revolvers from 1880 to 1920 to see what the pictures. And so I spent 45 minutes, and right as I find it, I'm like, oh, okay, here's what it is. My son walks in. He goes, what are you doing, Dad? I said, oh, I'm researching this revolver. And he looks at it, and he goes, oh, that's an 1851 Navy Colt revolver. And I'm like, what? I'm like, how in the hell did you know that? He goes, oh, there's a video game called Red Dead. That's what the gun he uses. And I said, I wish you would have came in 45 minutes earlier. It would have saved me some time. Yeah, he just walks in and is like, okay. So, video games. And so this is the final. And so this piece will be at Scottsdale next week. So I've got to varnish it and sign it and all that good stuff. And so this is kind of the idea of what I paint. I use historic photographs. I paint mostly historical people. I do contemporary people. We just did a photo shoot. I used my son as a photographer to shoot this young lady as a cowgirl. But mostly historical. I back it up. I've always been a history nut. And I don't know if you guys remember, but the Time Life books that had like the leather bound, they looked like the leather bound. So when I was a kid, my grandfather gave me a partial collection of those. He didn't have the whole set, but he gave me those. And I read those things from cover to cover, all those beautiful black and white pictures of the sepia tone of the gunfighters, the generals, the great chiefs, the warriors, and the railroad workers, and all that kind of stuff. But I have the whole collection now. I actually found it at the Albuquerque Flea Market. It has editions. It has the women and the railroad and the Canadians. And so it has the whole collection. And so just always loved those, always read that, always read them, read the stuff in there. And, it'd probably be another 15 years before I made that connection. But I love those things, and so that kind of spurred it. And then when I was about 13, So I'm a descendant of Quanah Parker, and my mom's name's Lenora Parker. And Quanah Parker's the last probably war chief of the Comanches. He was an enemy of the state. His mom was a white captive, and and his father was a chief. And so Quanah went to war against the United States. The Comanche were the tribe that stopped Texas from being its own country. So they went to war with us and lost. They needed military support, so they had to go crawling to the United States. And then that's when the United States came in, and then they went to war with the Comanches. And of course, I always tell people, we didn't have a defense against smallpox and cholera and, the slaughtering of the buffalo, or we'd still be kicking their ass today. So, so being a descendant of Quanah Parkers, it's a major historical thing. And I always knew about it growing up. I'd hear my grandfather talk about Quanah as grandpa, and I heard all the stories, and I knew all that stuff. But I didn't realize kind of who he was. And then when I was like 13, we had to do a paper over a historical figure, and my English teacher's like, hey, you should like do something, and over like your grandfather, great-grandfather, or, a chief or an Indian. And so I go to the library, and I'm talking to the librarian. So she pulls out a bunch of books like Sitting Bull and all this stuff. And there's like 3 books about Quanah Parker, and I was like, well, I didn't know. And so I got those, and I wrote the paper. And even at that age, I read some of the stuff, and you're kind of like, it's kind of, it's still like from the paper or the view of white people from the 80s, 1890s. And so I kind of wrote. I took my liberties and wrote, and the teacher loved it. And they're like, wow, that's like the best paper from like a 7th grade I've ever seen. And so it really kind of put something in me, and I investigated more and talked to family, and over the years I've really kind of grown and understood that. And then it's always kind of made me interested in history, not just mine, but other people's history. And so somewhere along the way, after painting 1 and drawing 2 and painting 2, when you've done enough copies or done enough still lifes and stuff, it was like advanced painting. And it's the same guy, Nick Abdullah. It's like, okay, you guys been painting, you've been painting all this stuff, color scales and gray scales and all this. Now, who are you? What are you about? What are you going to paint? What is your story? What are you going to do? And I was just kind of like, I don't know, And so I kind of started thinking about it, and I remember those books. And so, there was no internet back in those days. So I kind of started looking around for these books, and I kind of photocopied some of the images. And so I kind of used those, and I researched the person, because I remember, researching my great-grandfather and understanding. And so like I found a story, an image of a young man, and I painted that. And so when I went to critique, I was talking about the image, I was talking about why I painted this, who this person was. It's not just kind of this noble set, this Indian on the hill, looking at the clouds. It was actually a human being with a story. And so right then was kind of when I thought, okay, this is something I want to do. And I was only thinking like my graduation show, like that. I wasn't thinking a career. And so it just kind of started there, and it kind of went from there. And I love these images, and you always see them in black and white, and then like when you go to dances and feasts and stuff, and you see all the color, I always kind of like these black and white, didn't do injustice. And so even like movies today, I always kind of complain when you see these contemporary Western, all the Indians look like they're just in this drab buckskin, and I'm like, who does the research for these things? I mean, I know you're on a budget, but goddamn, so I kind of put that together, and I backed it up by, researching. And not everybody that I find that I love to paint has a story. And usually the women in that era, it's maiden, Hopi maiden, or so-and-so's niece, or so-and-so's daughter, just kind of that thinking in there. So this is kind of the idea. So the previous guy's name was Two Hatchet, and he's Kiowa. And this guy's name is Running Deer, and he's Kiowa. And so I thought I'd bring the real deal so you can kind of see what it does. And so I kind of add my own kind of flair into it and stuff. And if they have like a shield or a design, I kind of don't copy, because sometimes if it's a shield or some design like that, I always kind of figure that's somebody's medicine. Even if it's a prop and it's not, so I'll kind of generalize like a native design and things like that. So, but this is kind of the general idea, of finding these photographs and, painting in this way. And so, yeah, like I said, I've kind of made a career out of it. I do lectures on these, what I paint. It's like who I paint, why I paint, how I paint. And so and I love it. Like I'm always researching stuff, and sometimes I'll find an image that I love. For example, there's this guy. He was a Blackfoot messenger, and he had like this messenger bag and a rifle, real lean. He looked like a runner, and I painted it, and I think I just titled it Blackfoot Messenger. And then I was at a show one time, and this lady came up to me. She goes, "Oh my God, that's like my great great uncle, and his name is Deerfoot." And I was like, well, that's an appropriate name because he looks. And she told me the story about it. And my son actually took that painting and it's in his room. But she said, yeah, that's my great great uncle. It was my great great grandfather's brother. And she said they were messengers and they were in the Blackfoot Confederacy up in Montana in Canada. And she said they didn't ride horses to deliver message because they would be detected. So they would have a rifle, a bag, a food bag, and they'd run from fort or village to village or forts, delivering messages on foot. And so that's what he did. And so I learned when I put it out there, and so I'm kind of learning along the way, or I'll find an image that I've done, then I come across it again, and I'm like, oh, it has more information on it. So that's always kind of the fun part of that. And so earlier with the flute, I had mentioned, this is Doc Tate Nevakoya. He's my grandfather's best friend, and then grew up around him. We weren't related blood, but kind of having that relationship. And my dad always called him Uncle Doc, and he's the one that taught me how to play the flute when I was about 15, about my son's age. And so, so he was a national treasure, an Oklahoma State treasure. And for the first time in 2022, I think they asked me in 2020, but in 2022, they actually used native artists to do the native portraits for the state capital of Oklahoma. And so a friend of mine did Wilma Mankiller, the great Cherokee chief, and then a Choctaw friend of mine did the Choctaw Code Talkers, and then they asked me to do Doc, who's Comanche. And like I said, they didn't have any idea that I had this like real strong relationship with him. So for me to do that was like, wow. And it's a little more traditional painted than I usually do. And they asked that. They said, we really love your style. It's a little graphic, but can you do it a little bit more? And I'm like, I can do whatever the hell you want. And so, but the pressure was on because Doc's children are still alive, and I'm really good friends with them. I knew them. I grew up. We'd go out there and hang out and play football with his sons and stuff like that. So the pressure was to get it just right, because I'm like, oh man. So like to really work on the face. And I looked and I did preliminary sketches, and I'd send them into the committee, and they go, oh, can you do that? And the problem with Doc is he had this big mustache, and he wore glasses, and he played the flute, and he always wore that war bonnet. So any picture that I found, you could see his nose. And that was it, because he'd always be playing, and you didn't, and I was scrambling. I was like, these are all the pictures I could find, and the family didn't really have, but my dad came through, and he goes, oh, I got this little poster of him, and then he sent it to me. And old school, like he mails it to me. He didn't like take it. And so I used that, and it was like this photograph that he had done way back in the day, and I think it's from like 1996 or something like that. And so anyway, that was the image that I used, and I called the studio that took the picture and asked permission and all this kind of stuff. And so so here it is hanging in the state capitol. And what's kind of cool is it's right in between the governor's meeting room and the governor's office. So there's a Comanche right between old Stitt. I don't know if you guys know about Governor Stitt of Oklahoma, but he's one of those. And he's allegedly Cherokee, and he's like been the worst advocate for Native Americans in the state of Oklahoma. No, Oklahoma's like the largest state with Native population. So anyway, so Doc is right there, looking at him every day. And so, and this was one of the biggest things to me, because, again, with the theme of layers and talking about like my generational layer, my great grandkids can go in the state of Oklahoma and see this painting. It's going to be there because my son, and we were looking around, and you see these paintings from like 1930, 1920 that are there. So that's one thing like that will be there. And so, and I know that future generations will be able to go see that. And so I know that it's there. It's in a meaningful place, and hopefully it stays right there by the governor's office. And so to me, that was like one of the highest things, to do, because he's Comanche, I'm Comanche, my relationship with him, his relationship with my grandfather, and the fact that this storyline is going to keep going, and that, like I said, someday, my son's grandchildren will be able to see that and beyond. And so here's again the portraits. This guy's name is Many Shot At, and he's yeah. Oh, what a badass, huh? And so he was a Blackfoot Indian, and I did this series called The American Indian Cowboy. I started it probably 10 years ago, and everybody thought I was finding Indian faces and painting cowboy hats on them. But there's kind of this story of these Indian cowboys from like the 1890s to about 1950. And I always said that, these guys, their dads and grandfathers were warriors and hunters and free people. But then after all the wars and the reservations and the relocations and stuff, these guys are still horse people. So now they're on the reservation. So now they're tribal police. They're working for the ranchers that now own their former land, or they're doing like Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And they're not all the actors in the performers. Sometimes they're just the horse wranglers or the horse trainers. And so there was kind of this cool mix. And my grandfather was like that. He kind of had this hat. My grandfather is a World War II veteran. He was a Comanche code talker for the Army in Europe. And so he always kind of had this style, this cowboy hat, and kind of the Indian style. And so it was kind of this cool mix between chaps and beaded cuffs and braids and earrings and cowboy hats, and they just look cool, And when I'm painting this, it's always kind of like, what are we looking at? So I did this lecture. I did a show down at the Ellen Noel Museum in Odessa, and it was the American Indian Cowboy, and it was well received, of course, Odessa, Texas, and so it was nice. And so the story, even chatting with Adam Beach, the actor, he's kind of like, this is kind of a story that needs to be told, because there's a famous bronc rider in 1912 who won the world championship. His name was Jackson Sundown, and he was a enemy of the state. He fought in the Nez Perce Wars as a teenager, escaped to Canada for a while, came back, became a wrangler, a cowboy. Then he won the World Saddle Bronc Championship in 1912 at 52 years old. And so I can't imagine that. So there's kind of this whole imagery of this Indian cowboy. So I did that show, and like I said, I'd kind of do lectures about it and talk about what we're seeing. This guy's name is Longhorse, and he was an Assiniboine Sioux. And the photograph that I use as a reference, it says that he's working on a ranch by the Canadian-North Dakota border. And it just looks like he's just taking a smoke break. It looks cool. It's kind of like Marlboro Man-ish. And I think this photograph was like 1909. And he looks like a big guy, and he's having this cigarette with his working gloves and stuff on. And I always thought it was cool because it kind of reminded my granddad and his brother, my great uncle. And so they kind of had this look and this, because they'd have the bandanas, they'd have it tucked in their shirt, on the side. And in Oklahoma, there's a lot of native, being Oklahoma, they still wear cowboy hats and braids and boots. And, all my friends kind of growing up, all these kind of country guys. So there's kind of like this cool style of that still kind of stays in kind of some of these areas. And so this is kind of the idea with the American Indian Cowboy. And then this guy was Cheyenne Indian from Oklahoma. And he was an actor, and he went by the name Thunderbird, like in the 1920s. And he was in some of these kind of silent films and speaking films and stuff like that. And so he was this actor. And same thing, is just kind of this cool cigarettes. And then I got a good story about smoking cigarettes. And my grandfather's brother and my grandfather were at a powwow one time, and they're all duded up and dressed up, and my great uncle smoking a cigarette. One of his son comes up and he goes, "Dad, you're still smoking?" These guys are like in their 70s, and like, "You're still smoking cigarettes?" He goes, "Yeah." And he goes, "You've been smoking since you were like 12 years old, and you don't have cancer?" And my great uncle takes a big drag, blows it out. He goes, "You got to know how to smoke," And so that's kind of what these remind me of, So they're always that kind of got to know how to smoke, And then my son's like, "You're promoting smoking?" And so I said, "Well, back then they weren't smoking all those chemicals. It was just tobacco. It was the good stuff back then." So, yeah. So this is another one. This guy's name is Boise Natani, and Boise, and he's Shoshone, like Boise, Idaho, and I think Boise means like wood, hardwood, or something like that in French, and so this guy, his name is Amos Two Bulls, and I met some of his great nephews, Doug and Mike Two Bulls, that went to the Institute of American Indian Arts, and so I met those guys, and they were talking about this is the same thing. This is like their grandfather's or great grandfather's brother, And Amos Two Bulls was part of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and he was an actor in the show, and then just really beautiful person. And so I kind of made this portrait from him. And so, like I said, he was part of the show. He was one of the actors. He actually wrote in the show, and all this. And I think the photographer is Gertrude Kaiser, and so she traveled with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and took all these photographs. And most of her photographs, there's a few shots of the performance, but most of them were like she set them up in the studio and they're posing, they have all their stuff on. There's a couple good ones. There's one I did of a guy named Black Fox, and again, he's smoking a cigarette. He's actually kind of got a smirk like he's taking a smoke break. And so I kind of use those references. So I'm always digging, researching books. People send me stuff of their relatives, and I'm finding things. And this lady here, her name is Pretty Nose, and she was an Arapaho warrior, and she fought in the Battle of Little Bighorn, and she had been in a battle before that. And so the battle before Little Bighorn, she had saved her brother. So they were fighting. Her brother got knocked off the horse. She rode in, rescued him, saved him. And then she was in the Battle of Little Bighorn. And so she was considered a war chief. And the story about her is she fought at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and then a soldier from the Cheyenne or the Arapaho tribe came home after World War II, and she was very old. And when the warriors would come, all the war chiefs would receive them, and they'd have ceremony to welcome that home. And she was there, and he said she wore the white cuffs that a war chief would wear. He said, so I knew she was a war chief because when I came back from the war, she was there, and they all waited to receive you. He said, and so that marked her as a war chief. So they honored her as a war chief. So, we're always thinking, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and the warrior men, but, our women were too, especially the Plains tribes. I'm Comanche, and I know for a fact that our women wore bonnets, and, so they were warriors. So I did this painting of her in that capacity. And this is a young lady named Barbara. She's from Santo Domingo, and I kind of did this. I kind of mixed like Greek mythology with native, and kind of like the Cherokee women wear like feathered capes, and then a lot of the Southwest tribes use like the white paint, and then the Plains tribes use like the porcupine and deer-tail roach. And so as an archer, like a woman archer, because at the time a lot of women were getting in politics. Americans don't know how to handle strong women. It's like, yes, you can be a grandmother and a mother, and you can also be a senator and a vice president and president. So it kind of come out of that. And though it was kind of my response, because I have a boatload of nieces, and so I got to represent that. And so that's what this came out of. And this is kind of one of the contemporary people that I use. And then I'll just kind of run through these. I do animals, and then this is called Navajos Like Ice Cream. And so I found this portrait of this Navajo guy about 1912, and he's smiling, and I think his name's Elote. And so I researched. I said, was ice cream available in Arizona? And so I did, and actually it was in Tucson, and it was available. So my thought was, I did this because an artist friend of my dad's had done these paintings with Indians and ice cream and lipstick in the early 70s. And I thought, maybe at some point he was down there and he had some ice cream. Now he's back on the res, it's hot as shit. And he's thinking, I could really go for some ice cream. And that's all it is. It's not this big sacred mystery, thing. It's just kind of some humor in native art, because it's always so stoic and everything's right, so yeah. And so these are kind of some stencil pieces that I do, and this is called the Brooklyn Trickster. And so when we were in New York, somehow, I'll wrap this up, but this coyote had gotten into Central Park. And so we're watching the news, and everyone's going, ape shit over this thing. Like, oh my God, how did he get here? So they had these theories on the news that he must have come across the Brooklyn Bridge. That was like the closest thing to like nature was Brooklyn. And so like he had to come from Brooklyn, cruising there. They didn't know what to do with him. He was attacking dog, but he wasn't. He was just there. So yeah, everyone was just going crazy. And I kind of feel like it was like when people back east, they see an Indian, they're like, oh my God, how did this Indian get here? Because there's, few and far between. So anyway, I kind of did it, and I kind of tagged him up looking like a subway, because I thought if this guy's cruising through Brooklyn unnoticed, he's kind of camoed, and that's the Brooklyn skyline. It's kind of a fun piece that I did, and it might lead, because I keep reading stories about, wild animals in these cities and people spazzing out. And so the pieces that I donated, yeah, is the stencil series. And so I got to the point in my career where all my small stuff was starting to be like nothing was under $1,000, And I don't do prints or gigles or reproductions, and so I needed something smaller. And I'd been using stencils for patterns in my work, and so I kind of got this idea, kind of this Banksy idea, to kind of do these stencils. And so this is really layering. So I get these small canvases, I put a bunch of paint on, and then I get these stencils cut out of Mylar. And so this is Chief Joseph, and so I paint the background. I'll put the stencil on and I spray it, and then I spray it, and then I kind of enhance it a little bit because I want them to look like my hand painted pieces, so they kind of have like a same feel to it. And then I use like stencil for like patterns and things like that, and then I'll block stuff out, negative space. And so these I can kind of knock out, not easily, but just kind of the idea of the stencil pieces, and they're smaller, and like those kind of go for like $650. Then I have a little bit bigger ones that go for like $850. So everything kind of under under that price point. And they're fun because I can kind of experiment with them. For example, that was the same stencil, but it's flipped around, and so I can experiment with them, and like with color. And so sometimes I'm not carrying, I'm just laying colors down. Then all of a sudden I'm like, oh wow, that's a great color combination that I maybe wouldn't experiment, because I'm not experimenting on these. So I find great color combinations. And this is a painting. This was recently at the Coors Western Heritage Show in Denver. And then also I host a radio show, 101.1 KSFR Thursday nights. It's called The Business of Art with Nocona Burgess. And it's also, you can also go on KSFR and in the search line, put The Business of Art, and it'll bring up previous shows like a podcast. You can listen to them, the recordings. I had a show last night. And so it's kind of talking about the business side of things, not necessarily what they're painting, but the ups and downs, how you got started, what propelled you to get going, what were some of the things, what were some of the good and the bad that's happened in your career, and just kind of like I said, because we always see this, kind of the end result with the nice clothes and you're at the gallery, but it's like all the other shit that you have to go through to get there, and so that's kind of what the premise of that show is. And so, yeah, so we'll do a little Q&A, and so thanks, guys. And